I'll verify the current public status and core facts first, then begin the script in the requested voice without citations or stage directions. The Tara Calico case begins for us tonight, in the dry morning light outside Belen, New Mexico, where you can almost feel the grit of Highway 47 under a detective's shoes. There is no rush here, and the file will open slowly. You sit with it as someone might sit with a box of old photographs, carefully, quietly, letting each name and road and date return in its own time. On the 20th of September 1988, Tara Calico left her home on Brugg Street for a bike ride she knew well. She was 19 years old, a student, a daughter, a friend, and in the plain language of the first report, she was expected home before noon. You can picture the morning as investigators later had to picture it, not as a scene of drama, but as a route, a habit, a warm New Mexico road, and a young woman moving through familiar country with the steady rhythm of bicycle tires on pavement. The first feeling inside the Tara Calico case is not certainty. It is the opposite. It is the quiet wait of a missing hour, then 2 hours, then an afternoon, while ordinary objects begin to feel important. A clock on a kitchen wall, a telephone receiver lifted with growing worry, a mother's memory of what her daughter said before leaving. You learn, very early, that patient detective work often begins with ordinary things that suddenly stop being ordinary. Tara's mother, Patty Dole, knew the route well enough to feel the shape of it in her own body. She had ridden with Tara before, along that stretch near Belen and Rio communities, where the land opens into low desert colors and the sky can seem wider than the road itself. You can imagine Patty thinking first, in practical terms, as people do when worry is still trying to stay reasonable. Maybe Tara had slowed down. Maybe the bike had trouble. Maybe the heat had made the ride longer than usual. But by the time the Valencia County deputies were called, the day had taken on that still, careful feeling that settles over a household when people begin repeating details. She left around 9:30. She was riding her bicycle. She had said to come looking if she was not back by noon. You can hear those sentences in a small office, typed or written down, each one becoming part of the record, because no one yet knew which detail would matter. For the investigator arriving at a case like this, the first task is almost humble. You don't solve anything at once. You ask where she was last seen. You ask what she was wearing. You ask what road she used, who knew her routine, who might have noticed a cyclist that morning. You stand beside Highway 47 and let the place teach you what it can, while trucks pass, dust moves in the shoulder gravel, and the sun lays a flat brightness over everything. The road itself becomes a kind of witness, though a silent one. It holds no opinion. It offers only distances, turns, ditches, shoulders, and sightlines. You look down the long stretch and try to understand what could be seen from a passing car, what might be hidden by a rise, and how quickly a person on a bicycle could disappear from one driver's view. In a quiet investigation, geography is never background. It is a page you keep rereading. Early searches around Belen were built from urgency, but also from method. People looked along Tara's regular route. They watched for the pink, huffy bicycle, for clothing, for any item that might have fallen or been discarded. You can almost feel the dry weeds brushing at pant legs as searchers moved near the roadside, and the dull heat coming up from the pavement as deputies checked places that had to be checked because they were there. In time, small fragments were reported along the road, including pieces believed to be connected to Tara's belongings, and those pieces carried the strange sadness of evidence that is both useful and incomplete. A fragment can tell you someone was there or something passed through that place, but it cannot speak in full sentences. You turn it over in your mind like a detective turning it over in gloved hands, feeling the limits of what an object can say. This is what it was like to investigate the Tara Calico case at the beginning. It was a matter of walking the ground, asking the same questions kindly, and letting the day's small facts settle into order. There were no easy answers waiting in the first folder. There was only the family's fear, the officer's notes, the New Mexico road, and the growing knowledge that a familiar morning had opened into something no one could close. As you sit with this first section of the file, you begin to understand how much depends on memory. Witnesses were asked whether they had seen Tara riding that morning, whether they had noticed a vehicle near her, whether anything felt out of place. In older cases, Memory is like paper kept near a window. It can fade at the edges, even when the center remains sincere. Investigators had to listen carefully, not only for what people said, but for what repeated across accounts. Some reports placed Tara on or near Highway 47, south of Belen, moving through a route she had taken before. Some witnesses later spoke of a light-colored pickup in the area, and over time that possible vehicle became one of the details people returned to again and again. You can imagine a deputy writing it down without knowing how heavy it would become later, the pen making a soft sound against a form, the office air smelling faintly of toner, coffee, and dust. That is one of the quiet burdens of cold case work. At the start, every note is just a note. Years later, the same note may feel like a door that never quite opened. You read about the vehicle, the time, the road, the missing bicycle, and you feel the investigator's patience deepen because the case does not give itself away. It asks to be handled slowly. Tara Calico's family kept giving investigators what families often give in the first days: context, habits, and love translated into practical detail. Tara was responsible. Tara knew the route. Tara had plans beyond that morning. These are not sentimental facts inside a case file. They matter because they help define what was normal and what was not. You learn a person's pattern so you can see where the pattern broke. The house on Brugg Street becomes, in your mind, a place of last ordinary motion, a door closing, morning air coming in briefly, the small sounds of someone leaving for a ride. There may have been breakfast dishes, school materials, a familiar room waiting for her return. Investigators do not always write these things down, but you feel them around the edges of the record. Because every missing person case begins in a life that was still being lived. When you follow the work from the deputy's side, you sense how practical everything had to remain. Calls had to be made, roads had to be checked, hospitals had to be contacted, reports had to be entered. The family needed answers, and the officers needed facts that could hold under pressure. In the soft scrape of chairs, the click of file drawers, and the flat ring of office telephones, the investigation became a daily discipline. The first days are always crowded with possibility. A misunderstanding, an accident, a voluntary absence, a stranger, someone known. Investigators cannot afford to choose too quickly, and you can feel that caution in the way the Tara Calico case widened outward from the road. Each possibility had to be touched, tested, and either kept open or placed aside, while the family waited through hours that no clock could make gentle. You can imagine standing near the route late in the afternoon, when the heat begins to loosen and the shadows of roadside brush grow longer. The landscape would not have seemed dramatic. It would have seemed plain, almost resistant to explanation. That plainness is part of what makes the case stay with people. It happened not in some distant, strange place, but along a known road under a familiar sky. In the file, Tara remains vivid through the people who remembered her. She was a young woman with school, family, friends, routines, and a future that others could easily describe because it was so present to them. You hold that carefully as you move through the investigation. The work is not about turning her into a symbol. It is about keeping her real enough that every small effort still has a human center. As the first searches continued, the investigators were also learning what the case did not contain. There was no simple explanation waiting at the edge of the route. There was no quick recovery of the bicycle that answered everything. There was no immediate witness who could sit down and gently explain the whole morning. Instead, there were partial sightings, partial objects, and the growing stillness of a case that had begun to harden around unanswered questions. That hardening happens quietly. One day, people are searching because they expect a fast answer. Then another day passes, and the same search begins to feel different. The paper in the folder thickens. The family's phone keeps ringing. Reporters ask for updates. You begin to understand how investigators can be surrounded by activity and still feel the center of the case remaining very still. The Tara Calico case also had the particular difficulty of familiarity. Tara was local. The roads were local. People knew people, or knew someone who knew them. In a community like that, information travels in conversation, across kitchen tables, in parking lots, and through small offices where voices lower when the subject turns serious. For investigators, that can help, because people talk. It can also make the work delicate, because rumors can arrive dressed like facts. You, as the quiet detective tonight, have to keep separating the two. A fact has a shape, it has a source, a time, a place, and a way to be tested. A rumor has movement, but not always weight. It travels because people are afraid, or because they want to help, or because an old suspicion finds a new listener. In the Tara Calico file, patience means not mistaking motion for progress. There were searches over land that looked empty until people began moving across it with purpose. There were calls to agencies, conversations with friends, and interviews that may have felt repetitive to the people answering them. What did she say that morning? What did she usually carry? Did she seem worried? Did anyone follow her before? You ask the questions gently because the person answering may be replaying the same morning for the 100th time. The sensory memory of those interviews is easy to imagine if you have ever sat in a small government office. Fluorescent lights above, a metal desk cool at the edges, a box of tissues near the corner, placed there because some conversations need them. The investigator's notebook lies open, and the pen waits after each answer because silence can sometimes bring back one more detail. By the end of the early phase, the case had moved from immediate search into sustained investigation. That shift is quiet, but important. It means the work becomes less visible from the outside, though not less active inside the file. Leads are checked, tips are logged, names are compared. The route is revisited. The same maps are unfolded until the creases soften, and the same photographs are handled until the corners begin to wear. For Tara's family, waiting was not passive. It was an act repeated daily. They spoke with officers, answered questions, considered possibilities, and lived alongside a mystery that did not respect ordinary time. You can feel the ache of that in the case record, even when the language stays formal. Missing person files often speak in clipped phrases, but behind each phrase is a household listening for news. And then, months later, the Tara Calico case took on a second life in a way no investigator could have predicted from the first roadside searches. A photograph was found far from Belen, in Florida, and with it came a new kind of waiting, the kind that begins when an image seems to ask a question no one can answer at once. The photograph did not arrive like an answer. It arrived like another folder placed gently on the desk, another question with square edges and a glossy surface. You can imagine the investigator receiving word of it, far from New Mexico, and feeling that careful inward pause that comes when a case seems to reach across distance. It was found in June of 1989, in Port St. Joe, Florida, and for the Tara Calico case, it became one of the most discussed pieces of evidence. A woman had found the Polaroid in a parking lot near a convenience store, after a white cargo van had reportedly been nearby. The picture appeared to show a young woman and a young boy, both positioned in a way that suggested they could not simply leave. We don't need to linger on the discomfort of the image. For our quiet work tonight, it is enough to know that the photograph made people stop, look closer, and ask whether the young woman could be Tara. You hold the idea of that photograph carefully, because it came with distance and uncertainty. Florida was a long way from Belen, and many months had passed since Tara's morning bike ride along Highway 47. Yet families learned to recognize details that strangers might miss. And Tara's mother saw something in the face, in the expression, in the shape of the features. You can imagine her looking not as a detective first, but as a mother, while everyone around her tried to remain careful. Investigators had to treat the photograph as both important and uncertain, and that is a difficult balance. If they dismissed it too quickly, they risked missing a possible lead. If they accepted it too quickly, they risked building hope on fragile ground. So the picture traveled through analysis, through agencies, through experts who looked for structure, proportion, age, and resemblance. You can almost hear the quiet hum of office machines as copies were made, sealed, mailed, and reviewed. The Polaroid became a bridge between two places that did not naturally belong together. One place was the open New Mexico road where Tara had vanished during a familiar ride. The other was a Florida parking lot, bright with coastal heat, where an unknown person bent down and picked up a small square image from the pavement. In detective work, a bridge like that must be crossed slowly. You test each plank before trusting it. As you read this part of the file, you notice how much the investigation depended on image and interpretation. A photograph can feel immediate, almost intimate, and still refuse certainty. It gives you a face, light, shadow, and posture, but it does not tell you where it was taken, who took it, or what happened before and after. That is the quiet frustration of visual evidence. It shows something while withholding almost everything. The Tara Calico case was no longer only a local missing person investigation by then. It had become a case that people far away could recognize because of the image. Reporters called, viewers watched. Tips came in from people who thought they saw resemblance, memory, or possibility. You can sense the investigators trying to keep the room calm while the world outside the room grew louder. The work still required the same slow table, the same notes, the same checking and rechecking. The boy in the photograph was also considered carefully, and one possible name was raised by another grieving family. Some thought he might be Michael Henley, a young boy who had disappeared in New Mexico. Later, Michael's remains were found in a mountainous area not far from where he had gone missing, and that part of the photograph's possible meaning changed. You can feel how one uncertainty can fall away while another remains, like dust settling unevenly across an old desk. For Tara's family, the photograph did not resolve anything. It extended the waiting, it brought national attention, but attention is not the same as an answer. You can imagine how strange that must have felt, to see a private anguish held up before strangers, discussed in living rooms and newsrooms, measured by analysts, and still not know whether the person in the picture was truly your daughter. Compassion in a case like this means remembering that hope can be heavy. Investigators learned to live with that weight too, though in a different way. They had to follow the lead without being carried away by it. They had to look for the van, the origin of the photograph, the route by which it might have reached Florida, and any person who could explain it plainly. You can almost feel the paper trail growing longer, pages added from other states, other offices, other names. The file was becoming wider, but not necessarily clearer. That is one of the lessons inside the Tara Calico case. A new lead can make the investigation feel larger without making it simpler. It can open new roads while leaving the first road unchanged. Highway 47 was still there with its shoulder gravel and its remembered morning. Brugg Street was still there with its last ordinary departure. And now Port St. Joe was there too, a place on the map connected by possibility rather than proof. When you turn this page slowly, you notice the sound of the paper itself. It is thin, institutional, maybe softened by years of handling. The photocopied image may be slightly grey at the edges, as old copies often are, and a typed note may sit beside it with dates, names, and agency contacts. In your quiet room, you can almost smell warm toner, manila folders, and the dry cardboard of a box that has been opened many times. There is a patience required for photographs that look important. You cannot ask them follow-up questions. You cannot ask who stood behind the camera or why the image was left where it was. So the investigator must move around the photograph, gathering everything around it. Who found it? When? Where? What vehicles were seen? Who had been in the parking lot? What timeline could connect Florida to New Mexico, if any connection existed at all? The photograph gave the case a strange public afterlife, but the local investigation still had to return to people who knew the roads near Belen. It had to return to Tara's routine, her community, and the possibility that the answer might have been near home from the beginning. You can imagine a detective setting the photograph aside for a moment, not dismissing it, but making room again for the original map. Sometimes the oldest page remains the most important one. Years later, the investigation would keep circling back to Belen, and to the question of who might have known Tara's movements that morning. The road was familiar, and familiar roads create patterns that other people can notice. A cyclist who rides regularly becomes part of the landscape to neighbors, drivers, workers, and anyone who passes at the same time of day. You begin to see how routine can be both ordinary and revealing. In cold casework, investigators often rebuild routine with almost tender precision. They ask what time Tara left, how fast she usually rode, where she might have turned around, and what she carried with her. They ask about the weather, the traffic, the habits of local drivers, and any earlier unease along the route. To someone outside the case, those questions can sound small. To you, sitting with the file, they are the bones of the work. Tara's mother had reportedly stopped riding with her daughter for a time because of concerns about a vehicle or driver on the route. That detail, often repeated in accounts of the case, sits quietly but firmly in the file. It does not solve anything by itself. It does remind you that the family's worry did not begin only after Tara disappeared. There may have already been a sense, however faint, that the road was not always as peaceful as it looked. You can imagine an investigator listening to Patty describe that earlier concern. The room might have been still except for the soft click of a pen. Outside, someone could have been walking down a hallway, shoes tapping lightly on worn flooring. Inside, the words would have mattered because they pointed to attention, to someone noticing Tara, or to someone behaving in a way that made a mother's instincts sharpen. But instincts have to be translated into evidence. That is where the patience comes in again. A mother's concern can guide a question, but investigators still have to find names, vehicles, witnesses, dates, and corroboration. They have to be gentle without being vague. They have to respect what fear remembers while testing what the file can hold. You feel that balance all through the Tara Calico case, like a hand kept steady over a trembling line. Local rumors developed over time, as they often do in unsolved cases. Some people believed they knew who was involved. Some believed powerful connections had protected someone. Some believed the answer had always been near the community. You don't need to accept each rumor to understand why they formed. When a case stays open year after year, silence creates room, and people begin trying to fill that room with stories that feel like answers. For investigators, those stories were both a resource and a complication. A rumor might contain a true detail hidden inside exaggeration. It might also waste time, injure reputations, or pull attention away from better leads. You sit with the detective's problem here, and it is not glamorous. It is patient sorting. It is listening without surrendering judgment. It is writing down what can be checked, then returning to the work when the conversation ends. You can picture the town as the years passed. Roads widened or changed. Businesses opened and closed. People moved away, married, aged, and carried memories into new houses. A witness who had been young in 1988 might later sit across from a cold case investigator with reading glasses in one hand, trying to recover the color of a truck, the time of day, or the exact place where a conversation happened. Memory becomes softer, but sometimes it also becomes braver. The Tara Calico case asked that of people again and again. It asked whether someone who had been silent might speak. It asked whether someone who had dismissed a detail might reconsider it. It asked whether old fear could be set down long enough for truth to come forward. That is a quiet thing to ask of a community. It is not loud or cinematic. It is the slow knocking of a question that never entirely goes away. As the investigation aged, the file itself became a physical object with history. You can imagine binders with labels fading slightly at the spine, envelopes holding photographs, maps folded along old creases, and handwritten notes made by officers who had since retired. Cold case work often begins with the detective becoming an archivist. You do not only ask what happened, you ask what the earlier investigators knew, what they missed, and what they could not yet test. This is where the case becomes a study in time. In 1988, investigators had tools that were useful but limited compared with later decades. They had interviews, searches, phone records were available, vehicle descriptions, witness statements, and physical evidence that had to be preserved carefully. They did not have the same digital trails modern cases often leave behind. There were no easy location histories sitting inside a phone. There was the road, the people, and the paper. You feel that difference as you read. Today, a missing person's last movements might be traced through cameras, cards, messages, and devices. Tara's morning was quieter than that. It belonged to an older world of landlines, handwritten notes, local sightings, and people remembering what they saw while driving to work. The absence of digital noise makes the case feel almost still, but it also makes each human observation more precious. The early detectives had to rely on the old disciplines. They built timelines. They checked alibis. They compared vehicles. They followed leads that may have ended in ordinary explanations. They went back to people and asked questions again, sometimes learning nothing new except that the first answer still held. That is part of investigation too. Not every step brings discovery. Some steps only make the ground under you a little firmer. You can imagine the quiet disappointment of those steps. A tip comes in, written on a message slip or passed through a phone call. For a moment, the room brightens with possibility. Then the lead is checked, the person is found, the date does not match, or the vehicle turns out to be something else. The file accepts another note, and the detective returns to the same unanswered center. This is patience in its plainest form. The case also required people to sit with conflicting impressions. The Polaroid suggested one path. Local suspicions suggested another. Witness statements suggested certain vehicles or movements. Family memory suggested patterns and concerns. None of these could simply be thrown away, and none could be allowed to rule without support. You, as the detective tonight, learn to hold several possibilities at once, not anxiously, but like separate photographs laid across a table. The table matters in this kind of work. It is where the case becomes visible. You place the map near the witness list, the photograph near the timeline, the reports beside the old search notes. A cup of coffee cools near the edge, leaving a faint ring on a legal pad. Somewhere, an air conditioner clicks on and off, or a heater ticks in winter, and the room keeps its steady little sounds while the file waits for understanding. In the years after Tara disappeared, the public story of the case was often pulled toward the photograph from Florida. That is understandable. Images hold attention. They offer a face, a mystery, and an object people can point to. But the investigation itself could not live only inside that image. It had to keep returning to Valencia County, to the road south of Belen, and to the people whose knowledge might have been closer to the beginning. That return is gentle but persistent. You can imagine a cold case investigator driving the route years later, not because the road would suddenly speak, but because place can correct imagination. Distances feel different when you travel them. A bend appears sooner than expected. A shoulder narrows. A house sits farther back from the road than a map suggested. The air smells of sun-warmed dust and dry grass, and the past becomes less abstract for a while. When you stand in a place connected to an old case, you do not recover the past exactly. You recover scale. You understand how long a rider might be visible, where a vehicle could pull aside, and how exposed the road feels under a wide sky. That kind of knowledge may not create an arrest, but it deepens the file. It keeps the investigation rooted in real ground rather than rumor alone. The Tara Calico case also shows how families become keepers of continuity. Detectives change, sheriffs change, reporters change, but families remember every date, every call, every promised update, and every anniversary that arrives with the same question. You can feel that continuity in Patty Duell's long advocacy for her daughter, and in the way Tara's name remained spoken even when years passed without a confirmed answer. A family's persistence can become part of the evidence landscape. It is important to hold that persistence softly. People sometimes ask families of missing persons to be strong, as if strength were a single fixed thing. In reality, it may look like making another phone call, sitting for another interview, correcting another mistake in detail, or opening the door to another person who wants to talk about the worst day of your life. In the Tara Calico case, that kind of strength appears as endurance. Investigators, too, carry cases differently over time. An officer who searched in the early days might remember the light on the road, the expression on a parent's face, or the frustration of a lead that came close to meaning something. Years later, when a new detective opens the same file, those earlier efforts are still present in the paper. You can read them in the sequence of reports, in the careful descriptions, and sometimes in the gaps. The gaps are not always failures. Sometimes they reflect the limits of the era. Sometimes they reflect a witness who never came forward, a record that was not kept, or a clue that looked ordinary until it was too late to recognize. Cold casework teaches humility because it is full of these moments. You learn that hindsight can feel sharp, But the people working the first hours had only what was in front of them. As you move deeper into the file, you notice how often the investigation depends on revisiting old statements. A sentence given in 1988 may sound different in 1998, and different again when read decades later. Maybe a witness used a phrase that seemed casual at the time. Maybe a timeline contains a small inconsistency. Maybe a name appears once, then disappears. You mark it gently, not as a revelation, but as something to understand. That is the patient work behind cases like Tara's. You do not only look for new evidence, you look for new relationships between old facts. A vehicle description might connect with a local name. A rumor might connect with a place. A statement might connect with a time window that earlier seemed too broad. Most of these connections will not hold. But some may, and the investigator's task is to test them without hurry. There is also the emotional discipline of not forcing the case to become neater than it is. The human mind wants shape. It wants a beginning, a middle, and an end that explains the pain. The Tara Calico case resists that. It gives you a morning, a road, a missing bicycle, fragments, a photograph, rumors, and years of careful return. You sit with all of it, and you let the uncertainty remain visible. But there was another quiet movement in the file, one that happened not through a single dramatic discovery, but through the steady return of law enforcement to names that had never fully gone away. Over the years, officials in Valencia County and New Mexico spoke at times about persons of interest, possible local involvement, and the belief that people still living might know more than they had said. These statements did not close the case. They kept it breathing. You can imagine how cautious those words had to be. To say too little might leave the public thinking nothing was happening. To say too much might damage the investigation, or unfairly mark someone without enough proof. So officials spoke in careful phrases, the kind that sound modest but carry years of work behind them. Leads were being pursued. Information was still being sought. People with knowledge were encouraged to come forward. The language was formal, but the need underneath was human. For the detective, a person of interest is not the same as an answer. It is a point of focus. It is someone whose actions, connections, or statements require attention. You gather records. You compare accounts. You look for corroboration. You ask whether the person had opportunity, whether the timeline allows it, whether independent evidence supports the suspicion. In a cold case, this work can take years, because old proof rarely moves quickly. You may picture an investigator in a later decade, sitting with boxes that smell of paper, cardboard, and faint mildew from storage. The pages may not be in the order the investigator wishes. Some notes may be copies of copies. Ink may have faded. A photograph may be stapled to a report where the staple has rusted slightly at the bend. The work begins by making the old file readable again. That work can feel almost domestic in its quietness. Sort the reports, build a clean timeline, make a list of names, check which witnesses are still alive, find addresses, search property records. Each task is small, but together they create a room where the case can be seen again. You are not chasing. You are arranging, listening, and letting the file regain its shape. In the Tara Calico case, the passage of time changed the possible witnesses as much as it changed the evidence. People who were afraid in the beginning might become willing later. People loyal to others might reconsider. People who were too young to understand what they had heard might grow old enough to recognize it. Cold cases often depend on this slow human weather, the way fear, loyalty, guilt, and memory shift across decades. You can sit with that idea without making it harsh. A community holds many kinds of silence. Some silence comes from not knowing. Some comes from uncertainty. Some comes from fear of being wrong. Some comes from fear of being right. The investigator has to approach all of it with patience, because pushing too hard can close a door, while listening carefully may allow someone to step through. Every so often, the Tara Calico case returned to public attention. An anniversary would pass. A news story would revisit the photograph. A sheriff or investigator would make a statement. A podcast, article, or television segment would bring new listeners to the old road. Public attention can stir tips, and tips can matter. But attention can also create noise. You can feel the detective weighing each incoming call, asking quietly whether it contains a testable fact. There is a particular sound to tip lines in old cases. A phone rings in an office where other work continues around it. Someone speaks carefully or emotionally, or with the uncertainty of a memory that has waited too long. The person taking the call writes down names, places, dates, and phrases that may or may not become useful. Later, someone checks. That checking is where hope is either strengthened or gently set aside. You learn to respect even the tips that do not solve the case, because many come from people trying to help. Someone remembers a truck. Someone remembers a conversation in a bar. Someone remembers a classmate who seemed troubled after Tara disappeared. The investigator cannot live inside every possibility, but each one gets its moment of attention. That is part of honoring the case. Not believing everything, but listening well. The Polaroid remained one of the case's most haunting uncertainties, and over the years, different analyses and opinions did not create a single settled answer. Some believed the young woman looked like Tara, others did not. Technical review could suggest, compare, and evaluate, but the photograph never became the kind of evidence that ended the matter. You can feel how frustrating that is, to have an image so vivid and still so unfinished. For sleep, for quiet thought, we only need to understand its role. It kept one possibility alive while investigators pursued others. It pulled the case beyond New Mexico, but it did not erase New Mexico. It gave Tara's family something that might have been a sign while refusing to become proof. In that way, it became less like a key and more like a locked drawer. A locked drawer changes how you move through a room. You know it is there, you cannot pretend it is not. But you also cannot spend all night with your hand on the handle, because the rest of the room still needs to be examined. This is the feeling the photograph brought into the Tara Calico case. It was present, important, and unresolved, while the investigation continued to ask what happened on the morning she rode away. As you return to that morning again, you may notice how ordinary the known timeline remains. Tara leaves home. Tara rides a familiar route. Tara does not return by the expected time. Her mother searches. Law enforcement becomes involved. That simplicity is part of the sadness. There is no complicated prelude in the public facts, no elaborate chain that makes the disappearance easy to understand. There is only a young woman and a missing return. The investigator's work is to resist the blankness of that space. Between leaving and not returning, something happened. The file exists because of that unknown interval. Every interview, every search, every analysis, every public appeal is an attempt to bring definition to that hidden period. You can almost see it on a timeline as an empty stretch between two marks. The work is to approach that emptiness from every side. Sometimes approaching emptiness means looking at vehicles. Witness descriptions can be imprecise, especially when people are remembering a passing moment. A truck may be described by color, size, age, or sound. It may be remembered because it seemed close to Tara, or because it looked out of place, or because later news made the memory feel important. Investigators had to ask not only what was seen, but how clearly, from where and when. You can imagine old vehicle leads being checked in quiet, practical ways. Registration records, local ownership, repair shops, people known to drive certain makes. A pale truck parked near a house, a van mentioned in another state. Each lead has to be narrowed from a shape in memory into something with a plate, a driver, and a timeline. Most shapes never become names. A few names never become proof. That is why cold case investigation feels so much like patient craft. It is not one act of brilliance, it is a long series of careful fits. This account with that date, this road with that time, this person with that vehicle, this rumor with that verifiable fact. You work slowly because rushing makes pieces appear to fit when they do not. In the Tara Calico case, that danger was always there. You also sense how the public's need for an answer can press against the investigator's need for proof. People may say that everyone knows, or that the answer has been obvious for years. Perhaps they are right about certain suspicions, perhaps they are not. The file cannot move on communal certainty alone. It needs evidence that can stand in a courtroom, under questions, under scrutiny, under the calm pressure of law. This is one reason old cases can feel painful, even when investigators believe they know more than they can say. Knowledge inside an office is not the same as proof before a judge. A detective may have a theory built from years of interviews, inconsistencies, and local information, but if the proof is incomplete, the case remains open. You can feel the restraint in that. It is not indifference, it is the discipline of justice. Tara Calico's case has long carried that sense of an answer near the surface, but not fully reached. That is one reason people keep returning to it. The road is known, the date is known, the family's love is known. Some possible names and local suspicions have been discussed over the years. Yet the case has not settled into the peace of full public truth. It remains a file with breath in it. When investigators revisit a case like this, they often begin by building a modern timeline from old materials. You would place Tara's departure around the morning hours, note when she was expected home, mark when family concern became active searching, and then add the first official responses. You would include the locations of reported evidence, the sighting statements, the later Florida photograph, and every major investigative action afterward. The timeline becomes a quiet spine. Around that spine, you build people. Family, friends, witnesses, officers, persons of interest, analysts, reporters, and tipsters. Each person has a relationship to the case, even if that relationship is brief. The witness who saw a cyclist for a few seconds matters. The person who found a photograph in Florida matters. The family member who keeps the file alive matters most of all. You can almost hear the turning of pages as this work continues. There is the dry whisper of paper against paper, the soft click of a binder ring, the faint resistance of an old envelope flap. A photograph slides out halfway, and the investigator pauses before touching it further. These sensory details are not decoration. They are part of what it means to work an old case. The past arrives through materials. At times, a detective may have to call someone who has not spoken about Tara in years. The voice on the other end may grow quiet when the name is mentioned. There may be a pause while the person moves to another room, away from a television or family conversation. Then memory begins, slowly. Yes, I remember. No, I'm not sure. I may have heard something. You write it down, because uncertainty can still guide the next question. Those calls require gentleness. A cold case investigator is not only gathering facts, they are asking people to reopen rooms in themselves that may have been closed for survival. You can feel the care needed in the pacing of the questions. Not too fast, not too sharp. Let the person find the memory. Let the silence be useful. Sometimes the most important detail comes after the first answer, when the witness has had time to breathe. This is especially true in a community case. People may have carried things they did not know how to report, or did not trust enough to report, or felt ashamed for not reporting earlier. The investigator must make a place where late truth can still be welcomed. In the Tara Calico case, every renewed appeal carried that quiet invitation. If you know something, it is not too late to speak. Years later, something shifted again in the file, not because the mystery became simple, but because persistence brought the case back into official public view. Investigators and sheriffs returned to it, reviewed it, and sometimes spoke with more confidence that the answer might be connected to local people. For the listener tonight, this is not a moment for excitement. It is a moment to notice how long a case can wait for the right combination of memory, courage, and evidence. You can imagine the cold case meeting, a conference table, bottled water warming slightly under fluorescent lights, copies of the timeline placed in front of each person. Someone from an outside agency may be present. Someone knows the local roads. Someone else knows the older interviews. Together, they compare what is documented, what is suspected, and what still needs to be verified. The room is calm because the work is serious. No one in that room can change the morning of the 20th of September. They can only change what is known about it now. That is the humble promise of cold case work. It does not undo loss. It may not even bring every answer the family deserves, but it can bring truth closer, sometimes by one statement, one test, one recovered memory, or one person finally willing to say what they know. In the Tara Calico case, the idea of local knowledge has always mattered. If more than one person knew what happened, then silence itself became part of the landscape. You can picture that silence moving through years like a shadow that lengthens but never fully disappears. It might sit at a diner counter, in an old truck, at a family gathering, or inside a person who hears Tara's name and looks away. Again, we hold this gently. We are not here to accuse without proof. We are here to understand what investigating felt like when the case remained close to home, in memory and suspicion. For detectives, local knowledge can be both a doorway and a wall. People may know more than they say, but they may not trust the doorway enough to open it. So the investigator returns, patiently, with the same question made new by time. There is a quiet ethics to that return. The detective must care enough to keep asking, but not so forcefully that the work becomes careless. They must respect the family's need for answers and the legal requirement for proof. They must remember Tara as a person, not merely as a case title. And they must understand that every unresolved lead represents not only a task, but a piece of someone's life. As the file grew older, it also became part of the wider world of missing person investigations. Tara's name appeared beside discussions of cold cases, unidentified photographs, and long-running searches. People who had never been to Bellum learned the road's name. They learned the date. They learned about the bicycle ride and the Florida photograph. Public memory took the case outward, but the center remained the same. Tara did not come home. You can feel how that sentence stays quiet, but immovable. Tara did not come home. Everything else moves around it. The investigations, the interviews, the analyses, the rumors, the renewed statements, the anniversaries, and the articles all circle that fact. A good investigator never lets the circle become more important than the center. The center is Tara, and the people who loved her, and the mourning that remains unfinished. The physical evidence in a case like this asks for careful preservation. Even when older evidence seems limited, future tools may change what can be learned. A fragment, a photograph, a map notation, or an old report may become useful when paired with new information. You store things properly because you do not know what tomorrow's methods will make possible. That is another form of patience, almost a promise made to the future. In 1988, no one could know exactly what forensic tools would develop later. They could only preserve what they had. Cold case units live inside that hope. They reopen boxes because science changes, witnesses change, and old assumptions sometimes loosen. In cases solved after decades, the breakthrough often looks sudden from the outside, but inside the file, it rests on years of people refusing to throw things away. The Tara Calico case has not offered that kind of public resolution, but the same principle applies. Keep the materials, keep the names, keep the timelines, keep the possibility that someone will talk. You can almost feel the quiet weight of that responsibility when a detective closes the file drawer at the end of a long day. The metal slides shut, but the case is not closed. It is simply waiting for the next careful hand. Sometimes the waiting itself becomes part of the investigation. A person who would not speak in one decade may speak in another. A relationship may change. A fear may lessen. A conscience may grow louder with age. Investigators know this, and families know it too, though knowing does not make the waiting easy. The calendar turns, and each year adds both distance and pressure. You might imagine an anniversary in Bellend. The air in September still carries warmth, and the light may resemble the light of the original morning closely enough to hurt. People remember where they were when they first heard. Some drive the road. Some say Tara's name aloud. For investigators, anniversaries can bring calls, because memory often rises when dates return. The file may grow by a few pages each year. Those pages do not always contain breakthroughs. Sometimes they contain only renewed concern, repeated information, or a lead already checked. Still, they show that the case remains alive in public conscience. You can sit with the quiet nobility of that. A community does not always know how to solve a case, but it can refuse to forget one. Forgetting is not neutral. Remembering is work. As you continue through the Tara Calico case, you begin to notice how many people had to be patient in different ways. Tara's family had to be patient with the slow pace of law. Investigators had to be patient with incomplete evidence. Witnesses had to be patient with memory. The community had to be patient with uncertainty. Even the public had to learn that attention by itself cannot force truth to arrive. This patience is not passive, it is active, like holding a candle steady in a drafty room. It means returning to the same file when newer cases demand attention. It means making another call when the last one led nowhere. It means asking a retired officer what they remember, then comparing that memory with the report written decades earlier. It means accepting that progress may look like a cleaner timeline, not a headline. You can imagine the old reports being digitized or recopied, not as a dramatic act, but as administrative care. Pages scanned, names entered, dates standardized, maps attached, evidence logs checked. The hum of the scanner becomes part of the case's later life, replacing the typewriter and carbon copy of earlier years. The tools change, but the question remains unchanged beneath them. There is something deeply human in that continuity. The first investigator and the later investigator may never have met, but they are connected by the same unanswered morning. One wrote notes when the trail was fresh, the other reads them when the ink is old. Between them are years of weather, grief, speculation, and hope. You can feel the file passing from hand to hand, each person adding what they can before passing it on. And still, the road remains. If you return there in your mind, you may see it differently now. At first, it was simply the place where Tara rode. After the photograph, rumors, renewed reviews, and decades of waiting, the road becomes a kind of anchor. It reminds you not to drift too far into theories that float away from the known facts. The investigation began on that road, and every honest theory must eventually find its way back. The landscape around Belen has its own quiet language. Dry ground, open views, low buildings, the pale brightness of a New Mexico morning, the scent of dust after traffic passes, a distant dog barking, the small metallic sound of a gate moving in the wind. When you think of detectives walking that route, you realize they were not only searching for objects, they were trying to read a silence spread across ordinary land. That silence can feel almost stubborn. Searchers can walk a ditch and find nothing. They can return the next day and still find nothing. They can ask drivers and neighbors and still receive only fragments. In a case like Tara's, nothing found can be as meaningful and as frustrating as something found. Absence becomes part of the file. You note where the bicycle was not found, where she was not seen, where the road gave no easy answer. The missing bicycle matters because it was part of Tara's last known movement. A bicycle is not a small thing to vanish unnoticed. It has shape, color, metal, tires, and a presence that should leave some trace if abandoned openly. Investigators had to think about that. If the bicycle left the road with Tara, then how? If it was taken elsewhere, then by whom? You can feel the questions leaning against one another, none strong enough alone. Objects in missing person cases often carry a strange tenderness. A bicycle, a cassette, a piece of clothing, a backpack, a photograph. They are ordinary until the person is gone, and then they become charged with longing. Investigators must handle them as evidence, but families remember them as belongings. That difference matters. The same object can be measured, bagged, labeled, and still belong to someone's everyday life. When Tara's personal items or possible fragments were discussed, the family and investigators were looking at more than material. They were looking at nearness. A fragment near the route says that Tara's morning touched that place. It may say little else, yet even that small nearness can pull the whole investigation toward the ground, away from speculation, back to the roadside where the search began. You can picture an evidence envelope lying under a desk lamp, its label written in block letters. The paper has a slight rasp under your fingers. Inside may be something light enough to shift when moved. The investigator reads the label again, not because it has changed, but because repetition is part of care. Date, location, item, initials. These are the small rituals that keep confusion from taking over. The Tara Calico case needed those rituals because its public story became so layered. There was the original disappearance. There was the Polaroid. There were local suspicions. There were official statements across years. There were online discussions, documentaries, and retellings. Each layer could help or distort. The investigator's job was to keep asking what could be proven, what could be checked, and what belonged only to speculation. Speculation often feels satisfying because it moves quickly. Investigation moves slowly because it has to carry weight. You may hear a theory and feel, for a moment, that it explains everything. Then you place it beside the timeline, the evidence, and the known statements, and you see where it holds or where it thins. This is quiet work. It is not dismissive. It is respectful of truth. There were times when officials indicated they believed progress was possible, and those moments must have stirred difficult hope for Tara's loved ones. Hope in a cold case is complicated. It can warm a room, and it can reopen pain. You can imagine a family hearing that investigators still believed answers might come, and feeling both gratitude and the old ache of waiting. The case remains present because love remains present. For detectives, speaking publicly about possible progress requires care. Words can encourage witnesses, reassure a family, and signal that the case has not been forgotten. They can also alert people who may know more than they have shared, so the language tends to be measured, never giving away too much. You can hear years of restraint in phrases like continuing investigation, viable leads, and persons of interest. Those phrases may sound dry, but they carry human effort. Continuing investigation means someone opened the file again. Viable leads means someone checked enough to keep looking. Persons of interest means attention has narrowed, but proof still has work to do. When you read bureaucratic language with patience, you begin to hear the quiet movement inside it. The file is not sleeping, it is waiting with its eyes open. At this point in the case, the detective's work becomes almost meditative. Read, compare, call, drive, ask, listen, document. Then do it again. You return to the same page because a new conversation has changed its meaning. You return to the same witness because age has changed what they are willing to say. You return to the same road because the place can still remind you of scale, distance, and possibility. The rhythm is slow but not empty. It is like walking a shoreline after the tide has gone out, looking not for treasure, but for anything that does not belong. A sentence out of place. A time that shifts. A name mentioned twice by people who should not have known each other. A small inconsistency that may be memory or may be something more. You collect these things carefully without forcing them into certainty too soon. In the Tara Calico case, that kind of patience is the heart of the work. It is not the bright moment of discovery that holds the story together. It is the long refusal to let the case dissolve into folklore. Tara was not a rumor. She was not only a photograph, she was not only a name on an anniversary poster, she was a young woman who left home for a ride, and the file owes her its steadiness. You feel that obligation in the way cold case investigators speak about victims. The language often becomes simple. We have not forgotten, we are still asking. Someone knows something. These sentences endure because they are true enough to carry across years. They do not promise what cannot be promised. They simply keep the door open, and sometimes an open door is what an old case needs most. As night settles around our quiet room, you can let the file stay open on the table. The photograph from Florida rests in one section. The map of Highway 47 rests in another. Witness statements lie in their folders, some crisp, some softened by handling. Tara's name appears again and again, not as a headline, but as the center of all this patient effort, while the investigation keeps returning to the morning light near Belen, and the slow, careful work still waiting on the next page. The next page may be an interview, and at first, it may look like every other interview in the file. A name at the top, a date written in careful order, a few lines about where the person was living, what they remembered, and whether they had known Tara or simply known the road. You lean closer, not because the page announces itself, but because old investigations often hide their importance in plain language. Some interviews in the Tara Calico case would have been brief, the kind that confirm only a small piece of the morning. Yes, the person drove that road. No, they did not see her. Yes, they had heard about the disappearance from neighbors, school, work, or local news. These are not wasted pages. They create the edge of the unknown, marking where memory reaches and where it stops. Other interviews may have had a different texture. You can imagine a witness lowering their voice, not quite ready to say something as fact, but unwilling to keep it entirely inside. They may have heard a name, or a story, or a rumor repeated with too much confidence. They may have felt unsure whether it mattered. The investigator listens, and the pen moves slowly, because even uncertain words can become a path if they lead to something that can be checked. In a case like Tara's, the community's memory becomes a second landscape beside the road itself. The road has ditches, shoulders, and turnoffs. The memory has friendships, family ties, old grudges, loyalties, fears, and things overheard long ago. You cannot walk through that landscape quickly. You move carefully, the way you would move through a dim archive, touching only what you mean to touch. The Tara Calico case asked investigators to understand both landscapes at once. There was the physical route from Brogg Street toward the open road near Bellon. And there was the quieter route through people who may have known more than they first said. You can sense how patient that work had to be. A detective might drive the highway in the morning, then spend the afternoon in a small room, asking someone to remember a conversation from years before. The two kinds of searching feel different in the body. On the road, there is sun on your neck, dust against your shoes, and wind moving past the ears. In an interview room, there is the faint smell of paper, the scrape of a chair leg, and the pause before someone answers. Both settings belong to the same investigation. Both ask for attention that does not rush. Over time, certain local theories became part of the public history of the case, though theory and proof are not the same thing. Some officials and community members came to believe that Tara's disappearance may have involved people from the area, and that more than one person may have known the truth. You hold that carefully because belief can guide a search, but a case still needs evidence strong enough to stand in the open. That difference is everything. You can imagine how hard it is for a family to hear that others may know what happened. The thought can bring a painful kind of nearness. If someone knows, then the answer is not lost in the desert, not washed away by time, not beyond human reach. It is held somewhere, perhaps behind silence. That possibility can feel both hopeful and unbearable, and investigators have to speak of it with care. For a detective, silence is not empty. It has pressure, edges, and causes. Someone may stay silent out of fear. Someone may stay silent out of loyalty. Someone may stay silent because they are ashamed of not speaking sooner. Someone may stay silent because what they know came second-hand, and they do not trust themselves enough to say it aloud. You learn to listen for the reason, because the reason may suggest the way through. The work is sometimes as simple as returning to a name after many years. You find an address. You learn the person has moved. You contact a relative, check a record, or drive to another town where the houses are newer and the old case feels almost out of place. When the person opens the door, Tara's name brings the past into the present. You can feel the air change around that single name. There may be a kitchen table instead of an interview room. There may be a clock ticking, a glass of water between the detective and the witness, and afternoon light resting across linoleum. The person may say they do not remember much. Then they remember a little. Then they correct themselves. The detective lets the conversation breathe, because memory often arrives sideways, not when commanded, but when given a quiet place to land. That is why patience is not only an emotional quality in cold casework, it is an investigative method. You ask one question, then wait. You let the witness feel silence. You accept that they may need to speak in circles before they reach the center of what they mean. You do not mistake hesitation for dishonesty, and you do not mistake confidence for truth. You keep writing. In the Tara Calico case, a great deal depended on whether people could separate memory from what they later heard. This is difficult in a well-known case. A witness may truly remember seeing something, but over years, news stories, rumors, and community talk can attach themselves to that memory. The investigator has to ask when the memory first formed, who else was present, and whether the detail was known before it became public. You can feel the care in those questions. They are not meant to shame the witness. They are meant to protect the truth from accidental change. Human memory is not a sealed envelope. It is handled by time, emotion, and retelling. In a long investigation, a detective must treat memory as both precious and fragile. Like an old photograph, that should be held only at the edges. The case also required attention to official memory. Reports written in the first days may contain details that no one later emphasized. A dispatcher's log may show a time that helps narrow a window. An officer's quick note may name a person who later seemed more important. You sit with those early documents because they were made before the case had gathered layers. They can sometimes preserve the morning in its rawer form. There is a feeling to reading early reports after many years. The language may be spare. The officer may not yet know which facts will matter. A sentence that seems routine may now make you pause, because you have the strange advantage of hindsight. You know the case did not resolve quickly. The person writing the first report did not. That difference gives the page a quiet ache. As the Tara Calico case entered later decades, investigators had to work with both old limits and new tools. They could organize information more easily, compare data more widely, and share leads across agencies with less friction than before. Yet the central difficulty remained human. A missing bicycle could not be made to reappear by software. A silent witness could not be opened by a database. The case still needed someone somewhere to add something true. You can imagine the modern cold case desk beside the old file. A computer screen glows softly. A scanned report sits beside a physical folder. Search results appear, but they are only leads, not answers. The investigator may have one hand on a mouse and the other on a page written decades earlier. The rule contains two errors at once, and Tara's name holds them together. In some old cases, new testing transforms everything. In others, technology helps around the edges. It organizes, preserves, and points, but it cannot replace the first human observations. The Tara Calico case feels like the second kind of file, one where the road, the interviews, and the community knowledge remain central. Technology may help, but it cannot do the patient listening on its own. When you think about what it was like to investigate, you begin to notice how much of the work happens after public attention has moved on. A news segment ends, a newspaper is folded, a viewer goes to bed. But the file remains on a desk somewhere, and a detective still has to decide which lead to check tomorrow. The case lives in that quieter space, after the attention and before the answer. The family lived there too. Anniversaries, birthdays, ordinary days, and holidays, all passed with Tara absent and still present. You can imagine a family member hearing a song from the late 1980s, seeing a bicycle on a road, or noticing a young woman's laugh in a store, and being returned for a moment to that morning. Missing person cases do not stay inside file cabinets. They move through daily life in small, private ways. That is why the investigator's tone matters. Families can tell when a case is being treated as old paperwork rather than a living wound. A good cold case detective brings humility to the conversation. They do not pretend to fix decades of waiting with one phone call. They simply say, in words or in actions, that the case still matters. In the Tara Calico case, that message had to be renewed again and again. You can see it in public appeals. If anyone knows something, come forward. If you heard something years ago, say it now. If you were afraid then, perhaps time has changed what you can do. These appeals may sound familiar, but familiarity does not make them empty. They are invitations sent into the quiet, and sometimes, after many years, a person answers. The person who answers may not bring certainty. They may bring a name, a location, a second-hand account, or a memory of someone acting strangely after Tara disappeared. The investigator cannot treat it as truth, simply because it arrives late. They also cannot ignore it because it arrives imperfectly. So the work begins again. Compare, corroborate, locate, interview, document. The rhythm is steady enough to be almost prayerful. The Tara Calico case has always lived between the known and the suggested. The known facts are few and firm. Tara left for a bicycle ride, did not return, and has not been publicly found. The suggested elements are many: vehicles, local suspicions, possible knowledge held by others, and the disputed photograph from Florida. You, sitting with the file, learn to keep the firm facts on one side of the table and the possible leads on the other. This separation brings calm to the work. It does not make the case less sad. It makes the investigation more honest. You can look at a theory and say, this may be true, but this is what supports it. You can look at a rumor and say, this may point somewhere, but this is what remains missing. The table stays orderly, and in that order, the case can be approached without being overwhelmed. There is also a quiet tenderness in the way investigators sometimes learn a victim's ordinary life. Tara was not only the person who vanished, she had studies, routines, relationships, preferences, and a presence in the lives around her. You may find these details in interviews with family or friends, not because they solve the case directly, but because they help the investigator understand what was normal. Normal is the background against which the break becomes visible. A friend might remember Tara's energy, a family member might remember her responsibility, someone might remember the way she planned her day or how familiar her bicycle ride had become. These details keep the case from becoming abstract. You can feel the investigator absorbing them quietly, allowing Tara to remain a full person rather than a collection of dates. That, too, is part of care. In cold case work, care and rigor must stay together. Care without rigor can drift into assumption. Rigor without care can become cold. The Tara Calico case required both, because the facts were limited and the emotions were deep. You ask questions gently, but you check answers firmly. You respect the family's intuition, but you still need corroboration. You listen to the community, but you do not let rumor become verdict. This balance becomes especially important when names circulate publicly. Once a person is named in connection with an unsolved case, even informally, the consequences can spread. Investigators know this. Families know it too, though their need for answers is urgent and understandable. You can feel the tension between wanting truth spoken plainly and needing truth proven completely. The law moves slowly because it must carry that burden. As years passed, some people connected with the investigation expressed the view that local individuals were involved. Those statements gave shape to public understanding, but they did not end the case. You can imagine how a detective might feel after such a statement, knowing that the public hears confidence, while the file still demands proof. Confidence can steady the work. It cannot replace the last missing piece. The last missing piece in a cold case may be physical, testimonial, or both. It might be a preserved item tested in a new way. It might be a witness finally confirming what others only implied. It might be a document overlooked in an older storage room. It might be a person choosing at last to step out from behind decades of silence. You do not know which kind of piece Tara's case needs most. You only know the file has not stopped asking. You can picture an evidence room late in the day. Shelves hold boxes from many cases, each labeled, each representing a life altered. The air is cool and dry. The floor gives back a faint echo when someone walks between the rows. A detective finds the right box and lifts it carefully, because every old case deserves to be handled as if the next touch might matter. The Tara Calico case would sit among those quiet obligations. Opening such a box is an act of respect. You do not tear through it. You remove folders, check seals, read labels, and make sure the chain of custody remains understandable. You may find old photographs, correspondence, lab notes, maps, or copies of interviews. Each item carries the hands of people who worked before you. Some may have retired, some may have passed away. Their work remains, waiting to be re-understood. That is another thing we can sit with tonight. Investigations are not only about one detective. They are inheritances. A case like Tara's passes through agencies, administrations, and generations of officers. Each person may add a little, correct a little, preserve a little, or simply keep the file from being forgotten. The outcome may remain unknown, but the continuity itself is an answer to neglect. Neglect is what cold case work resists. It says that time does not erase obligation. It says that an old, unanswered question can still deserve new attention. It says that a young woman who disappeared on a September morning remains worthy of careful thought, even when the world has changed around her. You feel that principle every time Tara's name returns to the page. As you move farther into the file, you may notice how weather and season shape memory. September in New Mexico is not the deep chill of winter or the heavy heat of midsummer. It can hold a dry brightness, a sense of late summer thinning into fall. People remember light differently in that season. They may recall dust, the angle of the sun, the warmth on pavement, or the way morning shadows lay across the road. These details can matter because witness memory often attaches itself to the body. Someone may not remember the exact minute, but they remember driving with the window down. They remember glare in the windshield. They remember slowing for a cyclist or noticing a vehicle because the road was otherwise quiet. You, as the detective, listen for those body memories. They can anchor time more gently than a guest clock reading. The route itself would have had its own morning sounds: tires on pavement, a passing engine fading behind, wind pressing lightly against the ears, perhaps a bird calling from a fence line, or a dog barking from a property set back from the road. These are ordinary sounds, and that is why they matter. Tara's disappearance broke into an ordinary soundscape, not into a staged mystery. Investigators who walked or drove that route later had to imagine it without making it theatrical. What would Tara have seen? Who could have seen her? Where could someone stop? How long would it take to reach the turn? Was the road busy enough that a struggle would be noticed, or quiet enough that a few minutes could pass unseen? These are practical questions, but they carry a heavy tenderness. The practical questions may lead to measurements: distance from home, distance to the turnaround point, time expected for the ride, locations of possible sightings, places where evidence or fragments were reported. You can see a map marked with small symbols, each one standing for a possibility. The map does not accuse, it only holds the investigation's attention in place. Maps in old cases often become worn: folded, opened, marked, refolded. A line of highlighter fades from yellow to pale green. A pen mark circles a point that was once urgent. You place your finger near it and wonder what the investigator thought when making that circle. Was it a promising lead? A witness location? A roadside find? An unanswered question? The paper does not tell you the feeling, only the mark. The Tara Calico case contains many such marks, literal and figurative. The place she left, the road she took, the spot where a possible item was found, the Florida parking lot where the photograph appeared, the offices where reports were written, the homes where witnesses spoke. Over time, the case becomes a constellation, and your task is to see whether any line between the points is real. It is tempting to draw those lines too boldly. The mind wants connection. A distant photograph seems to reach back to New Mexico. A rumor seems to explain a silence. A vehicle description seems to match a person someone already suspects. The investigator must let each line remain pencil until the evidence makes it ink. That restraint may feel slow, but it is what keeps the case honest. In the quiet study of the Tara Calico case, restraint becomes almost a form of compassion. It protects the family from false certainty. It protects the case from collapse under weak assumptions. It protects innocent people from being folded into a story they did not create. And it protects Tara's memory by refusing to replace truth with something easier. Still, restraint does not mean inaction. The best investigators keep moving. They call again, they review again, they ask a lab whether anything new can be done, they contact another agency about an old photograph, they compare a statement with a timeline. They do not perform urgency, but they do not rest either. The movement is quiet, and it is sustained. You can imagine a detective after hours, alone with the file, not because the case requires loneliness, but because old cases often ask for uninterrupted time. The office is dimmer now. The daytime phones have stopped. A desk lamp makes a small pool of light over the notes. Outside, the parking lot is cooling. Inside, Tara's name appears on page after page, and the detective reads until the lines begin to settle into memory. This is the kind of work that rarely appears in public accounts. The rereading, the cross-checking, the small notes in the margin, the question marks beside dates, the list of people to call tomorrow. The quiet feeling that something in the file is almost aligned, though not yet ready to be called a fact. You sit with that feeling because many cold cases live there for a long time. The Florida photograph would return in those readings again and again. It had its own chain, its own witnesses, its own uncertainty. Investigators had to ask whether the woman in the photograph was Tara, and if so, what that meant about movement, captivity, and time. If not, the photograph still belonged to another unknown story that deserved care. Either way, it could not be treated lightly. For the purposes of Tara's investigation, the photograph was both a lead and a shadow. It cast itself across the case, changing how people saw it, even when it did not provide final proof. You can imagine copies of it moving through newsrooms and law enforcement offices, each copy a little less sharp than the original. Faces become grainier, edges soften, certainty does not increase with repetition. That is important. Seeing something many times can make it feel more true, but investigation asks a different question. What do we know? How do we know it? Who confirmed it? Can it be tested? In the Tara Calico case, the photograph's emotional force was real. But emotional force is not the same as evidentiary certainty. You keep both truths in view, and you let neither erase the other. The family's response to the photograph was part of the case's human history. A mother looking at a possible image of her daughter is not making a cold comparison. She is searching with the whole force of love. Investigators must honor that, without surrendering their duty to caution. You can feel how delicate that moment would be. The room quiet, the photograph between hope and pain. Other experts and agencies examined the image with different methods and reached different levels of confidence. That disagreement kept the photograph from settling. For the investigator, disagreement is not necessarily failure. It shows where certainty ends. It marks the boundary between what can be said and what can only be considered. In a cold case, knowing the boundary is useful, even when it is disappointing. The public often struggles with that boundary. People want the photograph to be either definitely Tara or definitely not. They want the case to move cleanly in one direction. But some evidence remains unresolved because the world does not always provide enough information. You can let that be true tonight. The uncertainty does not need to be forced. It can rest beside the other unanswered parts of the file. As years move forward, the investigation's emotional center also changed with the loss of people who had carried it from the beginning. Families age, parents become older, advocates grow tired. Some never receive the answer they spent their lives seeking. You hold that gently in Tara's case, because the passage of time does not only affect evidence, it affects the people waiting for evidence to become truth. When a parent waits for a missing child across decades, time behaves differently. The calendar moves, but one morning remains fixed. The 20th of September stays lit in a separate way. For everyone else, it becomes a date in an old article. For the family, it remains a doorway that never closed. Investigators who understand this will speak softly when they enter that doorway. You can imagine a later detective meeting with family members, perhaps with a folder, perhaps with only a notebook. They cannot promise resolution. They can explain what is being reviewed, what cannot be shared, and what information is still needed. These meetings require a quiet honesty. Too much confidence can wound later. Too little hope can feel like abandonment. The right tone is careful, human, and plain. The Tara Calico case has always deserved that tone. It is easy for public storytelling to become fascinated by the mysterious elements, especially the photograph, the rumors, and the possible local knowledge. But inside the investigation, the tone has to return to steadiness. Tara was a person. Her family needed truth. The community carried a wound. The case required proof. Those four facts can guide the voice of every page. If you were the detective tonight, you might make a list, not of theories, but of needs. Confirmed timeline, verified sightings, vehicle evidence, witness credibility, physical evidence status, photograph origin, local statements, possible corroboration. Each need is simple when written down, but each one opens into hours, weeks, or years of work. The list is not dramatic. It is the shape of patience. Then you would begin with the timeline again. This is how old files steady themselves. Tara leaves home in the morning, the expected return time passes, Hattie searches, deputies are called, the route is checked, items or fragments are reported, witnesses are interviewed. Months later, the photograph is found in Florida. Years pass, and the investigation returns to local questions. Each line becomes a place to ask, what supports this, and what remains unknown? You may notice how many verbs in that timeline are ordinary. Leaves, passes, searches, checks, interviews, finds, returns. Cold case work is made of ordinary verbs repeated with extraordinary care. The language itself can help us sleep because it moves steadily. It does not lunge, it does not shout, it walks beside the file and lets each fact arrive at its own pace. The old agencies involved had different roles across time. Local deputies knew the roads and community. State investigators could bring broader resources. Federal attention could assist when the photograph and possible interstate questions arose. Outside experts could assess images or evidence. You can feel the file traveling between desks, each office adding its own stamp, initials, and formal phrasing. The case became shared, but never simple. Shared investigations require coordination, and coordination creates its own quiet labor. Calls must be returned, copies must be sent, reports must be summarized without losing detail. A detective in one state may need to understand a road in another state they have never driven. A local investigator may need to explain why a small community rumor matters. The work is as much translation as discovery. The Tara Calico case's movement between New Mexico and Florida shows this clearly. A photograph found on the Gulf Coast had to be considered against a disappearance in the high desert. The distance itself raised questions. Could there be a connection? Was the resemblance meaningful? Was the image unrelated but tragically similar? Investigators could not answer by feeling. They had to build paths through facts. You can imagine a map of the United States on a wall, or in an atlas, with Belen and Port St. Joe separated by a long sweep of states, highways, weather, and time. The line between them is not a road anyone can take without evidence. It is only a question, but questions when handled properly can still guide work. They tell the investigator where to look, even when they do not promise what will be found. In the quieter parts of the investigation, attention returned to small inconsistencies. A person's account changes. A time shifts. A vehicle is described differently by different people. A rumor places someone in one location, while another account places them elsewhere. None of this is unusual. Human accounts often vary. The investigator's job is not to pounce on every difference, but to understand which differences matter. Some differences come from ordinary memory. Some come from fear. Some come from rehearsed stories weakening over time. You cannot know which until you compare them gently. You ask the person to tell it again, perhaps years later. You ask what they meant by a phrase. You ask whether anyone else was present. You watch not for drama, but for coherence. The truth often has a quiet shape. When you sit long enough with Tara's file, you begin to feel the difference between noise and texture. Noise distracts. Texture deepens. A wild theory may be noise, even if it seems exciting. A small witness detail may be texture, even if it seems dull. The investigator learns to prefer texture, the sound of a truck at a certain time, a person's unexplained worry, a road shoulder too narrow for comfort. These details help the case breathe. The case also teaches the limits of public certainty. People outside an investigation may speak with confidence because they do not have to prove what they believe. Detectives live under a stricter rule. They may suspect, but they must verify. They may believe, but they must document. They may care deeply, but they must let evidence lead. This is not coldness. It is how care survives contact with law. You can hold that idea as the pages turn. Care without proof can become a story. Proof without care can become a mechanism. The Tara Calico case asks for both, held together across a long span of years. It asks the investigator to remember a daughter, a road, a family, a photograph, and a community, while still asking the plain questions that law requires. At some point, every cold case investigator confronts the possibility that the answer may be known by someone who has grown old with it. That thought changes the tone of the work. The person with knowledge may have built a life around not speaking. They may have children, grandchildren, routines, illnesses, and private fears. A detective may knock on their door not with anger first, but with the steady awareness that time is running out for truth. The room inside that conversation may be very quiet. A television muted, a chair creaking, the smell of coffee or dust or medicine in the air. The investigator says Tara's name and watches what happens. Maybe they say they have already told everything. Maybe, after a long pause, they begin somewhere far from the point, because the point is too heavy to touch directly. You let them begin there. A good interviewer knows that memory sometimes circles before it lands. They may talk about the town then, about who knew whom, about the way things were handled, about fear, about youth, about mistakes. The investigator listens for what is factual, but also for where the person's voice changes, not as proof, but as guidance. Human beings often reveal the map before they reveal the destination. The Tara Calico case's long life means that some interviews likely carried this late life quality. People remembering their younger selves, people reconsidering what they heard, people asking whether it matters now. The answer, from the file's point of view, is yes. It matters now because Tara still matters. It matters now because families do not age out of needing truth. It matters now because silence has consequences even when it grows old. When we think of investigation as patient detective work, we often imagine persistence as something hard and relentless. But there is a softer version too. Persistence can be a detective calling at a respectful hour. It can be a letter written plainly. It can be a meeting arranged in a quiet office. It can be the decision to ask one more time, not with pressure alone, but with a door left open for conscience. You can feel how that matters in Tara's case. If the truth is held by people, then the investigation must reach people, not merely records. Records are vital, but records cannot feel remorse, fear, loyalty, or relief. People can. Cold casework rests on the possibility that a person may eventually want the burden of knowledge to become something else, something spoken, something placed into the hands of those who can use it. The hands matter too. Investigators must be ready when information comes. A late statement is only the beginning. It must be compared with evidence, tested against timelines, and checked for details the speaker could not have learned from public accounts. If it contains a location, that location must be searched or evaluated. If it contains a name, that name must be handled with care. The work after speech can be as important as the speech itself. You might imagine a detective ending such an interview and sitting for a moment before starting the car. The recorder or notebook rests on the passenger seat. Outside, the neighborhood looks ordinary. A sprinkler ticks, a dog barks once, a curtain moves in a window. The detective knows the conversation may matter, or may dissolve under checking. Either way, the next step must be careful. This is the quiet rhythm we keep returning to. Receive, record, test. The Tara Calico case has moved through that rhythm for years. It has absorbed leads from family, community, media attention, law enforcement reviews, and distant possibilities. Some leads may have gone nowhere. Some may still sit in the file with a small mark beside them, waiting for one more piece. There is no shame in a lead going nowhere if it was checked honestly. That is part of the work. A detective may spend days confirming that a possible sighting was mistaken, or that a vehicle was elsewhere, or that a story was only a retelling of something from television. From outside, that can look like no progress. Inside the file, it clears fog. It lets the investigator see the remaining shapes more clearly. As the years lengthened, Tara's case became part of the language of unsolved mysteries. But for investigators, it remained stubbornly specific. Not a symbol first, not a legend first. A young woman from Belen, a bicycle ride, a family waiting, a road, a photograph that may or may not connect. A set of local questions that never fully quieted. Specificity is what keeps compassion from becoming vague. You return to the specific details because they are respectful. Tara Calico, Belen, New Mexico. The 20th of September, 1988. Highway 47. Brugg Street, Port St. Joe. The Polaroid. The family's appeals. The cold case reviews. Each name and place is a small weight on the table, keeping the story from drifting into mist. You handle each one gently. There is also a kind of humility in saying that much remains unknown. The investigator does not lose authority by admitting uncertainty. In fact, honest uncertainty may be the only authority an old case can bear. It says, this is what we know, this is what we believe may be true, and this is what still requires proof. In the Tara Calico case, that structure matters because the public story has often reached beyond the confirmed facts. You can feel the value of returning to the confirmed facts whenever the case becomes too crowded. If the Polaroid overwhelms the room, return to the road. If rumors grow too loud, return to the timeline. If theories multiply, return to Tara's known movements. This is how a detective keeps calm inside complexity. The file may be large, but the center remains small enough to hold. When the next box comes down from the shelf, the investigator may not know what they are looking for at first. Sometimes the act of rereading is what creates the question. A name appears in one report and again in another, years apart. A location mentioned casually aligns with a vehicle route. A witness who seemed peripheral connects to someone more central. The file is not only read, it is listened to. Listening to a file is strange. And any patient investigator knows the feeling. The pages begin to speak in patterns. Repetition becomes noticeable. Absence becomes noticeable. A detail that felt dull on the first pass begins to glow faintly on the third. You do not call it a breakthrough. You call it something to check. The language stays modest, and the work continues. In Tara's case, that checking might mean returning to old associates, family acquaintances, local residents, or people who had been named in tips. It might mean comparing old addresses, employment records, school connections, vehicle ownership, and prior statements. It might mean asking whether a person who once seemed unreachable can now be found. The detective's tools are ordinary, but the patience behind them is deep. You can imagine making a call to a retired officer who worked the early case. Their voice may carry age now, and perhaps some frustration. They may remember the heat, the mother's worry, the road, the feeling that the answer was close or far. They may remember names that never made it into final reports, or impressions that could not be treated as evidence. You listen respectfully, because institutional memory can fade unless someone asks for it. But again, you separate memory from documentation. A retired officer's recollection can guide the search, but if the file does not support it, you keep looking. This is not distrust, it is discipline. Everyone's memory changes, even the memory of people who cared deeply and worked hard. In cold casework, respect includes verification. The Tara Calico case also reminds us that rural and small-town investigations can be intimate in ways city cases may not be. People know the roads, the families, the vehicles, and the histories. That intimacy can make witnesses easier to find but harder to question. A suspect may be someone's son, nephew, friend, classmate, or neighbor. A rumor may travel quickly, but a formal statement may come slowly. The social fabric itself becomes part of the terrain. A detective working such a case must move through that fabric without tearing it unnecessarily. They must ask hard questions in a place where hard questions echo. They must understand local relationships without becoming captured by them. They must notice who speaks freely, who avoids the subject, and who becomes angry when Tara's name is raised. None of that is proof by itself. It is context. Context can be powerful when used carefully. A person's opportunity matters. Their access to a vehicle matters. Their knowledge of Tara's route matters. Their behavior after the disappearance may matter. Their statements over time may matter. But each element must connect to something firmer. You're building not a mood, but a case. That distinction is the quiet architecture beneath all the work. As you sit with these later investigative efforts, the room around you seems to settle. The lamp is warm. The pages are still. Outside, night has deepened, but the file remains open. You can imagine the detective's hands resting for a moment on either side of the papers, not in defeat, but in thought. There is so much known and so much not known, and between the two lies the long work of narrowing. Narrowing is often what progress looks like. Not solving, not yet, but narrowing. A timeline becomes tighter. A rumor is discarded. A witness is confirmed. A vehicle lead becomes less vague. A person's statement is shown to be impossible or unexpectedly consistent. The investigation moves not by leaps, but by inches, and the inches matter because they point in a direction. The public may never see most of those inches. They may hear only that the case remains active or that investigators are seeking information. Yet inside the file, inches accumulate. They show which roads have been walked and which remain. They show that someone has not let the case turn to dust. In Tara's case, that accumulation is part of the quiet story of the investigation. The story is quiet, but it is not empty. It contains the hum of fluorescent lights, the scrape of file drawers, the smell of dry paper, the warmth of roadside dust, the soft ring of phones, the weight of a box lifted from a shelf, and the silence after a difficult question. These are the textures of patient detective work. They are how an old mystery is carried through time. You can let the next page open to another appeal, another review, another careful return to the people of Valencia County. The words may ask for information in plain terms, but beneath them is a deeper invitation. If you have carried something, set it down. If you remember something, speak it gently. If you were afraid before, consider whether the years have made room for truth. And with that, the Tara Calico case moves forward again, not quickly, but with the steady pace of a file that refuses to close, while there is still one more person to ask, one more page to read, and one more quiet morning to understand. One more quiet morning can mean something very ordinary to a detective. It can mean driving the same route at the same hour Tara once rode it, not because the landscape will confess, but because the body understands distance better than a report does. You feel the road through the tires, the light through the windshield, and the slight pull of attention at every driveway, shoulder, and curve. The Tara Calico case asks for that kind of presence. A map gives you measure, but a road gives you proportion. You notice how quickly a vehicle appears in the mirror, how long it stays visible, and where the view opens or narrows. You notice whether a cyclist would feel exposed, whether the shoulder offers room, and whether a driver could slow without drawing much attention. These observations may not solve the case. They make the old statements more real. When a witness says they saw a truck, you can place that memory against the road. Where were they sitting? Which direction were they traveling? Was the sun ahead of them or behind them? Did they have seconds to observe or only a passing glance? You ask these questions quietly because a witness can be sincere and still mistaken about color, make, speed, or order. The Tara Calico case contains many moments where sincerity and uncertainty have to share the same page. A person may have genuinely wanted to help, and yet their memory may have been softened by fear, conversation, or time. You do not push that person aside. You thank them, you write carefully, and you test what can be tested. That is the investigator's way of respecting both the witness and the truth. On some days, the work might have felt like following footprints in dry sand after the wind had already passed. You can still see a few impressions, but not the whole path. A name appears. A vehicle is mentioned. A time is estimated. Then the trail thins. The detective does not curse the sand. The detective marks what remains, compares it with other traces, and keeps moving at a patient pace. As the case aged, the social memory around Bellin became part of the investigation's atmosphere. People who were young at the time became adults with families of their own. People who were adults became older, with memories that might sharpen around certain moments and fade around others. You can imagine an investigator asking about 1988 and watching someone's face shift, as if an old room had opened behind their eyes. That room may contain a school hallway, a workplace, a roadside conversation, or a name spoken with discomfort. It may contain nothing useful. It may contain only the grief of remembering that Tara was gone. Still, the investigator enters gently, because human memory must be invited, not seized. The quietest interview can sometimes add a single detail that changes the way earlier pages are read. Some people may remember where they were when they first heard Tara was missing. News in a smaller community moves with a particular speed. It travels through phone calls, neighbors, school offices, shops, and family conversations. You can almost hear the low voices, the repeated question, the concern rising through town. Have they found her? Was she on the bike route? Did anyone see anything? For investigators, that early spread of news could be helpful and difficult at the same time. It meant many people were alert, watching roads, and remembering the morning. It also meant details might be repeated, altered, or absorbed into public conversation before formal statements were taken. You, as the detective tonight, have to listen for the first version of a memory, the one closest to the event, before later versions gathered extra weight. This is why old reports matter so much. A note taken in the first week may be less polished than a later retelling, but it may also be closer to what the witness originally perceived. The handwriting may be hurried, the language may be spare. Still, there is value in its nearness. You can feel the investigator leaning over those early pages, searching for the plainness before the case became famous. The Tara Calico case did become famous in a certain way, though famous is a poor word for another family's sorrow. It became widely known because of the photograph, the road, the unresolved local questions, and the long passage of time. People far from New Mexico learned Tara's name, and some tried to help. Others speculated. The file had to absorb attention without losing its center. Attention can make a case feel close to resolution even when the evidence has not changed. A television segment airs, and phones ring. A new article appears, and tips arrive. A podcast revisits the case, and old names re-emerge. You can feel the wave rising and falling. Then the office quiets again, and the detective must sort through what came in, one line at a time. Some tips may have been heartfelt but vague. A caller remembers seeing someone who looked like Tara in another state years earlier. A person remembers a van, or a photograph, or a conversation they cannot place clearly. A detective does not mock these leads. They are part of the public trying to help. But help must be translated into facts, and many feelings do not survive that translation. Other tips may have been more concrete. A name, a place, a statement someone allegedly made, a vehicle associated with a person near the right time. Those leads require more careful handling because they can point toward real people. You can imagine the file note becoming longer, the follow-up list more precise, the detective's voice quieter on the phone. Concrete leads carry both promise and responsibility. In an unresolved case, responsibility includes protecting the investigation from being shaped by impatience. The public may want authorities to name people, make arrests, and end the story. Families may want that too, with every reason. But a weak case can fail, and failure can make truth harder to reach later. The investigator has to move when the evidence is ready, not when the ache becomes loud. That restraint can be painful. You can feel it in the Tara Calico case, where public statements over the years sometimes suggested that investigators had strong beliefs about local involvement. Strong belief is not nothing. It may reflect years of interviews, patterns, and information not fully public. Yet belief must still become proof, and proof has its own slow requirements. The file waits for those requirements like a locked door waits for the right key. The right key may not look dramatic. It may be a witness statement that confirms a timeline. It may be a piece of physical evidence connected to a person. It may be a confession supported by details not publicly known. It may be several small facts that together finally hold. Cold casework is often less about a single shining clue than about many plain pieces becoming steady. You can picture a detective arranging those pieces late at night. Not literally on a corkboard perhaps, but across documents, spreadsheets, notes, and reports. A person's name appears beside a vehicle. The vehicle appears beside a witness statement. The statement appears beside a time window. The time window returns to the road. Around and around the case goes, not spinning, but tightening. When a case tightens, the investigator may feel it before they can announce it. The possibilities become fewer. Certain theories fall away, certain names remain. Certain questions return so often that they begin to define the work. Who knew Tara's route? Who was near Highway 47 that morning? Who had access to the vehicle described? Who spoke later? And who stayed silent? The questions are not new, but they are clearer. The Tara Calico case has lived for a long time inside those questions. Each return to them is not failure, it is method. In old cases, progress often means asking the original questions with better information, better organization, and sometimes with witnesses who are finally ready. You do not demand that the file become new. You let the old file become readable in a new way. There is a quiet companionship between the investigator and the earlier detectives. You may disagree with what they emphasized. You may wish they had preserved something differently or asked one more question. But you also understand they worked under the limits of their time. They had the first shock, The first searches, the first frightened family, and the first rush of leads. You inherit their work not from a distance, but from the same obligation. That obligation keeps the tone humble. It is easy to judge an old investigation from a later desk. It is harder to stand in the first day, when every possibility is still open and every hour feels urgent. The early detectives did not know the photograph would appear months later. They did not know which rumors would persist. They did not know that people would still be speaking Tara's name decades afterward. They worked with the morning they had. You, reading later, work with the years. You can compare, revisit, and test with knowledge they did not possess. That does not make you wiser. It makes your task different. Cold case investigation is a relay, not a replacement. One person carries the file as far as they can, then someone else lifts it feeling both the weight and the warmth left by earlier hands. The warmth matters. Cases are not cold because people stopped caring. They are cold because the public trail cooled, because leads thinned, because proof did not arrive. Inside many cold cases, care remains very much alive. It shows up in organized folders, preserved evidence, careful appeals, and detectives who can recite details years after first reading them. In the Tara Calico case, care is part of why the file endures. Care also shows in the way Tara's story has been told by those who loved her. They did not let her become only a mystery. They spoke of her as a daughter, student, and young woman with a life underway. They corrected details. They kept her name present. They endured the repeated public handling of painful evidence because they wanted answers. You can feel the dignity of that in the spaces between the official reports. When investigators speak with families, the case file becomes more than paper. It becomes a shared burden. The detective may bring updates, but also questions that ask the family to revisit ordinary things. Did Tara mention anyone? Had her routine changed? Did she seem concerned? Did she know someone connected to a vehicle? The family answers, perhaps again and again, because love will do repetitive work if it might help. You can imagine a family member opening a drawer to find an old photograph, a school item, or a piece of writing that reminds them of Tara's voice. The investigator receives such details carefully. Not every personal item becomes evidence, but every item belongs to the life at the center of the case. The room may grow quiet around it. Even detectives who have seen many cases understand the silence of a family object. The Tara Calico case also required investigators to navigate public misidentifications and possible sightings. When a missing person becomes known, people begin seeing resemblance everywhere. A young woman in another state, a face in a crowd, a photograph in a newspaper. Each report may come from sincere concern, and each may require checking. The work can be wearying, but it cannot be dismissed automatically, because once in a while, a distant sighting matters. To check a sighting, you need dates, locations, descriptions, and follow-up. Was the person seen before or after the photograph became public? Did they speak? Did anyone else see them? Was there a record, a receipt, a police contact, a photograph, or a name? You learn quickly that a sighting without anchors is like a leaf on water. It moves, but you cannot stand on it. Still, each sighting may have stirred hope for Tara's loved ones. That is the difficult part. Investigators may learn to keep emotional distance from unverified reports, but families often cannot. A phone call saying someone may have seen your missing daughter can open a door in the heart. When the lead fades, the door closes again. The case file records the outcome, but it cannot fully record that feeling. The photograph from Florida intensified this cycle because it offered an image people could compare with strangers they saw elsewhere. After the Polaroid became public, possible sightings could carry the photograph's shadow with them. People might look for a face they had seen reproduced on television or in print. Investigators had to ask whether the report arose from direct memory or from recognition shaped by media attention. Again, the work returned to careful separation. Separation is a repeated act in this case. Separate known from possible. Separate memory from rumor. Separate public fascination from investigative value. Separate resemblance from identification. Separate suspicion from proof. You do this again and again, not sharply, but gently, as someone sorting old letters by date and sender. The order helps the heart stay calm enough to think. In the Tara Calico case, one of the enduring pains is that several paths seem plausible enough to keep drawing attention, but not settled enough to bring rest. The Polaroid path, the local involvement path, the silence of the community path, each has its own gravity. A patient investigator does not let one path erase the others until evidence allows it. You can imagine the case board, whether real or mental, with these paths arranged in separate columns. Under each column are reports, dates, names, and open questions. Some columns may be thick, others may contain only a few pages. The detective moves between them, comparing where they touch and where they do not. The work is less like chasing and more like weaving, though the pattern remains incomplete. At times, a lead may pull the investigation toward a particular person. That is when caution becomes even more important. You gather everything available before confronting, accusing, or speaking publicly. You look for independent support, not just repeated rumor. You ask whether the person's statements changed, whether the timeline allows involvement, and whether physical or testimonial evidence connects them meaningfully. Suspicion may begin the work, but it cannot finish it. The legal standard is not the same as the emotional standard. A family may feel certain, a community may feel certain, a detective may even feel certain in a private way. But the legal system asks for evidence that can survive cross-examination, alternative explanations, and the passage of time. In old cases, that standard can be difficult, especially when witnesses die, memories fade, and physical evidence is limited. This difficulty can be mistaken for inaction. It often is. From outside, people may ask why nothing has been done if investigators believe they know who was involved. Inside the file, the answer may be complicated. A statement is not enough. A rumor is not enough. A pattern is not enough. The evidence must connect, and the connection must be strong. You can feel the burden of that patience. The Tara Calico case asks us to understand this burden without letting it become an excuse. Investigators must be careful, but they must also keep working. The line between patience and delay can be thin. A good cold case review tests whether old assumptions have become habits, whether leads were set aside too easily, and whether new tools or new witnesses can move the case forward. The file deserves that disciplined restlessness. Disciplined restlessness is a gentle phrase for hard work. It means the detective is calm but not asleep. It means the case is old but not abandoned. It means every few years, or every time new leadership or new information arrives, the pages are opened again. Someone asks what has changed. Someone asks what can be done now that could not be done before. In that question, the file breathes. You can imagine new investigators coming to Tara's case with respect for those before them, and also with fresh eyes. Fresh eyes notice different things. They may not be carrying the same local assumptions. They may see a connection earlier readers missed. They may ask a basic question that feels almost too simple, and sometimes simple questions are the ones an old file needs. Why was this lead closed? Who verified that statement? Where is the original copy? The physical condition of the file can influence the work. Loose pages may be out of sequence, copies may be faint, some items may be referenced in reports but stored separately. The investigator must first make the file trustworthy as an object. That means indexing, scanning, labeling, and finding missing attachments. It is quiet administrative work, but without it the case can remain foggy. You can hear the scanner again, that soft mechanical slide, as old pages become digital images. The room smells faintly of warmed plastic and paper dust. A detective checks that each page is legible, that names are spelled consistently, that dates are entered correctly. A small typing error can matter in a database search. A misfiled report can disappear for years. Care begins with order. Order then allows comparison. Names can be searched across reports, vehicles can be grouped, locations can be mapped. Witnesses can be sorted by proximity, date, and reliability. You begin to see patterns that were harder to see when everything existed only in separate folders. Modern tools do not solve the case by themselves, but they help the detective ask better questions of old material. The Tara Calico case, because it spans so many years, is exactly the kind of file where organization matters. Public attention may focus on the dramatic elements, but the real work may involve finding whether a name in an early witness report matches a person mentioned in a later tip, or whether a vehicle described vaguely in one place aligns with a registration record elsewhere. These are quiet links. They matter. A quiet link can lead to another interview. You contact a person and ask about a day long ago. They may say, "I already spoke to someone." You say, "I understand. We are reviewing the case again." The phrase "reviewing the case again" can carry comfort and fatigue at once. It tells the person the matter is still important, while also asking them to walk back into an old and possibly painful memory. Some witnesses may be relieved to speak again. They may have worried their earlier statement was misunderstood. They may have remembered something later and never known who to tell. They may have kept a clipping, a note, or a private suspicion. You can imagine them opening a drawer, retrieving a yellowed newspaper article, and smoothing it on the table, as if the paper itself had been waiting. Others may resist. They may say they do not want to get involved. They may fear consequences in a small community. They may doubt that speaking now will make any difference. The investigator cannot always overcome that resistance at once. Sometimes the first contact is simply a seed. A card is left. A number is offered. Tara's name is spoken with respect. The person is given time. Time has already shaped the case, so it is fitting that time may also help loosen it. A witness may call back days later, or months later, or after another anniversary story appears. They may begin by saying they are not sure. The detective makes room for that uncertainty. Not sure can be the first honest step towards something useful. In the deeper layers of the Tara Calico case, you sense the possibility that truth may have been divided among people. One person may know a location, another may know a vehicle, another may have heard a statement, another may know who was together that morning. No single person, apart from those directly involved if local theories are right, may hold the whole story. The investigator must gather fragments until they either form a pattern or do not. Fragment work requires patience with incompleteness. You do not reject a fragment because it is small. You also do not worship it because it is suggestive. You label it, place it, and see whether other fragments fit nearby. Over time, a mosaic may begin to form, or it may not. The discipline lies in allowing both outcomes. That discipline is especially needed when a case has become part of internet discussion. Online spaces can preserve information, raise awareness, and bring forward people who might not contact police otherwise. They can also repeat errors, harden rumors, and create false certainty. Investigators have to recognize what public attention can provide without letting it steer the file recklessly. The case belongs to truth, not to the loudest version of the story. You, tonight, remain in the quieter posture. You are not trying to win an argument about the case. You are sitting beside the file, noticing what it asks. The paper asks for patience. The road asks for scale. The family's waiting asks for compassion. The photograph asks for caution. The rumors ask for verification. Tara's name asks to be held clearly without being swallowed by the mystery. This posture is why the investigation feels almost like a long vigil. Not a dramatic vigil, but a working one. The lamp stays on. The file stays open. The notes continue. Someone checks another lead. Someone calls another witness. Someone drives the route again. In that repeated care, the case remains present. There may have been moments when investigators felt close. A statement comes in that seems to align with older suspicions. A person of interest says something inconsistent. A witness finally names someone. The room may become very still, yet even then the next question is not, "Can we announce this?" It is, "Can we prove this?" That question brings the heartbeat of the case back to its steady pace. Proof in an old case often has to be built from corroboration. If one person says something, who else can support it? If a vehicle was seen, who owned it? If a story was told, when was it first told? If a location is named, can it be searched or matched to known facts? Corroboration is the quiet scaffolding behind justice. Without it, a story may collapse under its own weight. You can feel how exhausting that can be. Every lead becomes a branch with smaller branches. A name leads to an address. An address leads to a relative A relative leads to an old employer. An old employer leads to records that may no longer exist. The detective follows what remains, and sometimes what remains is only a memory, a faded form, or a person saying they wish they remembered more. The Tara Calico case has likely known many such dead ends. We can say that gently. A dead end is not a failure of care. It is a place where a path does not continue, at least not now. The investigator marks it and returns to the main road. Later, with new information, the same path may open again. Old cases are full of doors that are closed until another key appears. This is why notes matter so much. A lead that seems unhelpful today may be useful later if another person says something similar. A vehicle description too vague in one report may gain meaning when paired with a second statement. A name mentioned once may seem minor until it appears again years later. The file remembers connections that individual people might forget. You can imagine a detective writing a note for someone they may never meet, a future investigator who will open the file after another decade has passed. The note needs to be clear. It needs to say what was checked, what was not, and why. It needs to separate fact from impression. Good case notes are a form of kindness across time. They spare the next person confusion. In this way, every investigator on Tara's case writes not only for the present, but for the future. They may hope to solve it themselves. They may also know that the file could outlast their assignment, their career, even their life. That knowledge can make the work feel heavy, but also meaningful. You are keeping the path visible for someone who may come later with the missing piece. The missing piece may come from a person who does not yet know they have it. Someone cleaning out a relative's house may find a photograph, a letter, a diary, or a note. Someone hearing an old name may connect it to something they were told as a child. Someone who dismissed a memory as gossip may realize it matches a public appeal. Cold cases can change when ordinary people reconsider ordinary things. That is why public appeals often include simple language. No detail is too small. Call if you remember anything. You may think it doesn't matter. It might. These phrases are familiar because they are true. Investigators know that witnesses often self-edit. They decide something is probably nothing. They avoid bothering police. They assume someone else already called. Years can pass because of those quiet assumptions. The Tara Calico case asks for the opposite of self-editing. It asks that possible facts be given to investigators, where they can be tested. Not to social media first, not to rumor first, to the people who can compare them with what is not publicly known. You can feel the care in that request. It is not asking people to solve the case alone. It is asking them to hand over pieces. As you sit with the file, you notice how often cases turn on the willingness to share one piece. It may be a small correction. The truck was not blue. It was light grey. The conversation happened before the news aired, not after. The person who said it was not alone. The route was slightly different that day. These small corrections can change the angle of the investigation, like turning a lamp toward a corner previously dim. The lamp image returns because it fits the work. A cold case is not flooded with light all at once. It is lit gradually, by angle and patience. You move the lamp, you see a little more, you move it again. Some corners remain dark, but the room becomes less confusing. In the Tara Calico case, each renewed effort is another adjustment of that light. The case's long duration also means investigators have had to contend with loss of records, changes in agencies, and shifting public memory. A person who once took a statement may be gone. A business mentioned in an old report may no longer exist. A road may look different. A property may have changed owners. The detective must reconstruct not only the event, but the world around the event. Reconstructing a past world is slow. You may look at old maps, yearbooks, phone directories, property records, and newspaper archives. You may ask, who worked at a certain place? Who drove a certain route? Who spent time with whom? The past is not a fixed room waiting untouched. It has to be rebuilt from pieces, and some pieces are missing. You can almost smell the archive where some of that rebuilding happens. Dust, cardboard, aging ink, and the cool dryness of stored paper. A clerk retrieves a box. A detective turns pages carefully. Names appear in old type. Advertisements from the late 1980s sit beside reports of ordinary community life. Somewhere in those pages, the world Tara knew becomes visible again. This visibility matters because cases do not happen in isolation. Tara's route belonged to a community with habits, relationships, and patterns. Understanding that world may help explain who could have seen her, who could have approached her, and who would have known enough about her routine to matter. The work is not only forensic, it is social, geographic, and historical. You, as the quiet detective, begin to feel the case stretching across layers. The immediate layer is the morning ride. The second layer is the early search. The third is the photograph in Florida. The fourth is the community's long memory. The fifth is the cold case review, with modern eyes returning to old pages. None of these layers disappears. They rest on one another like paper in a thick folder. A thick folder can feel discouraging, but it can also be useful. It means people kept records. It means leads were received. It means Tara's case continued to generate effort. The investigator's task is to prevent thickness from becoming confusion. You make indexes. You build timelines. You mark duplicates. You identify original documents. Slowly, the file becomes navigable. There is a quiet satisfaction in making a difficult file navigable. Not celebration exactly. More like setting a room in order before beginning hard work. The chair is pulled close. The lamp is adjusted. The pages are stacked. The map is unfolded. The detective can now move through the case without stumbling over its own history. That order may be the first step towards something more. In Tara's case, something more has always seemed possible enough to keep people returning. The belief that someone knows. The belief that a local answer may exist. The belief that a witness could still speak. These beliefs are not proof, but they are not meaningless either. They shape the investigative posture. They tell the detective not only to search outward, but to listen inward toward the community that first held the morning. Listening inward means understanding old relationships. Who were Tara's friends? Who knew her family? Who was familiar with the bike route? Who was present in the area? Who had access to vehicles mentioned across reports? Who later spoke and who avoided speaking? These questions are sensitive. They move through real lives. The investigator must ask them with seriousness and restraint. You can imagine a notebook page divided into columns, names, connections, vehicles, statements. Follow-up. The handwriting may be neat at first, then tighter as the page fills. A small arrow connects one note to another. A question mark sits beside a time. The detective is not creating a story. The detective is creating a way to test stories. That difference, again, is essential. The testing may involve revisiting physical locations beyond the main route, a property named in a tip, a road mentioned in a rumor, a place where people gathered in the late 1980s. The detective drives there and looks, not with the expectation of sudden discovery, but with the need to understand. How far from Highway 47? How visible from neighboring homes? How easy to reach? How likely someone would remember a vehicle there? Place can confirm or weaken a statement. If a witness says they saw something from a certain angle, you stand there and look. If a person claims a drive took a certain amount of time, you drive it. If a location seems hidden in words, you visit and see whether it is hidden in fact. This grounding is one of the most calming parts of investigation. It returns imagination to earth. The earth around Belen is patient in its own way. It does not hurry to explain. It holds roads, dust, brush, fences, yards, and distances. People pass through, leaving less behind than detectives wish. Yet the land still provides scale, and scale matters. You can feel the difference between a theory that works on paper and one that survives the drive. As the case continued across decades, officials sometimes renewed calls for information with increased specificity, suggesting that they believed the answer could still come from people who had remained silent. You can hear the careful hope inside that. It is hope aimed at human conscience rather than at chance. It says, someone may know and someone may still choose to help. The words are simple because the request is profound. To the person carrying knowledge, hearing such an appeal may create a private reckoning. They may remember where they were. They may remember what they heard. They may remember choosing silence before. Years have a way of changing the weight of choices. What once felt like protection can begin to feel like burden. What once seemed impossible to say may become possible in age, grief, or reflection. A detective cannot force that transformation, but can make space for it. They can keep the contact information public. They can speak without ridicule. They can assure people that late information still matters. They can show, by reopening the file, that the door remains open. In cold cases, the open door is sometimes the most important tool. The Tara Calico case remains an example of how an investigation can continue even when the public sees only occasional movement. Between those public moments, there are quieter tasks. A lead is checked, a statement is compared, a file is reorganized, a family is updated, an old photograph is reviewed again. None of these tasks may become a headline, but each one belongs to the work. And the work, as you can feel now, is not only about finding a person responsible, it is also about preserving Tara's place in the world of the known. When a person disappears, uncertainty tries to take over everything. Investigation pushes back by naming, dating, mapping, and remembering. It says, "This happened here, on this morning, to this person, and we will keep asking what came next." You can let the file rest open at a page where a witness's words are typed in plain black letters. The statement may not be complete, it may not be enough, but it is one human attempt to return to the morning and retrieve something from it. The paper is still, the lamp is warm, and somewhere beyond the quiet room, the old road waits in memory, carrying the same question forward into the next careful interview, the next reviewed statement, and the next slow pass through the evidence.